guys, welcome back. For those of you who haven't been introduced, I'm Sandy and we are working on a quilt along that we've been running on Facebook in a Jelly Roll Quilt group. This is the 4th week of our quilt along and we are at the point of block assembly. We are laying out what our quilt's going to look like. This is the same pattern. I've got more blocks down here for a different version of it. But basically we're laying out the blocks to make the pattern that we want to see. It's a really easy layout. Although the blocks are the same, they all feature 6 little itty bitty 2.5-inch squares and 1 rectangle that is 6.5 by 2.5 inches tall. All the squares, all of the individual blocks in our quilt look the same. It's all the same 6 patch with the rectangle, or basically a 9 patch. If this had been 3 individual white squares, it would have been a 9 patch, so it's just like a modified 9 patch. What we're doing this week is just laying it out, and this is a fairly simple quilt. The blocks are all identical, and the question is do they look like this, or do they look like this? That's all there is to it. Some of them are going to face, if this was a clock, this is 12 o'clock, right? So either this piece is going to be up at 12 o'clock, or it's going to be over at 9 o'clock. That's it. All we have to do is figure out our layout. Sounds really simple. Seam allowances make it less simple. So as you're constructing your quilt, some things to think about. I tried really hard to fix some of my seam allowances in here. I like my quilts to lay as flat as possible so that when I'm quilting them later, I'm not going to have huge bumpy seams to go over, that there's just few layers and that things are interlocked and knit together really well so that it's really flat and smooth and even. It makes quilting it a whole lot easier. This particular quilt that I'm laying out now, I haven't actually finished all the blocks. I'm kind of doing it as I go, but the reason I did that is because I had such an interesting time with the one behind me, trying to just make sure all the seam allowances are good. So these are laid out and I'll show you what I'm talking about if you can bear with me. I don't know how well this is going to film, but I'll try to explain it. So the back of this block, you can see the seam allowances press up or down and they all go in a direction. And when the next block lines up, these seam allowances are currently facing down, 6 o'clock if you will. The next one is going to go up and line up against it, and it's going to go like this. And so I want those seam allowances, if possible, to face in the opposite direction. So these ones are facing up 12 o'clock and these ones are facing down at 6 o'clock. So that when I put these together, they're going to knit together as well as they possibly can. These are the pieces that go together, and I'm just going to go ahead and pin them. Let's see, am I pinning them in the right order? That is how they go. So yes, these are going to pin together. When I sew blocks together, I think about which part of the quilt block is going underneath the presser foot first, and I pin. So I line up the blocks so that the seam allowances, again, are facing in opposite directions. It should come to a fairly even point. When they do that, they knit together really well and you can feel that it's really flat. I pin in an opposite direction from how I'm going to sew. If I'm going to sew it like this, right, 1/4 inch all along this section, I'm going to have my pins go in at an opposite angle. And I do that so that if I don't want to remove each pin as I sew, I don't have to. It doesn't matter when you're doing block by block. It does matter when you're sewing rows of 10 blocks together. It makes it a lot easier. And I always put my pin in whichever part of the quilt block is going to go under the feed dog or the presser foot first. The reason I do that is if something's going to get messed up, if something's going to get folded by either the feed dogs under here or the presser foot itself, I want that part to be pinned so that it's more likely to come out the direction I want it to go. So these are also lined up. Again, they make a cute little point right there in the very center. You can see those come together. They lay together really well and interlock. And I'm going to just put in a pin, and I put them into the seam allowance itself before that joint, and I kind of make sure that it comes out so that I can just sew right over top of my pins. I don't bother typically to sew the ends or pin the ends because I hold those. And I don't want pins in my fingertips. So I'm going to just line that up. I'm going to sew this with a 1/4 inch seam. Again, since my pins are going in an opposite direction to the actual sewing, and I have to unpin them for each one, I can just sew right over top of them. Sometimes the pins do bend a little bit. I'm not worried about that. They are still really functional and they'll last a long time. Pins are not expensive in the grand scheme of things. And the ones that I buy, I have a tendency to buy the ultra thin. A, they leave smaller holes, and B, they are more flexible. So, and then I'll pull those out. I'm going to open this up, and you'll see that all of those little points are really, really well matched. Sewing those seam allowances in opposite directions does make a difference. I have a tendency to press my blocks in rows, and so the whole top row on this 9 patch, right, the whole block, this seam allowance in between, I'm going to press all in one direction on one row, so the whole top row here is going to go this way, and then when I do the next row, they'll all go the opposite way, so that I can pin at all of those intersections as well. I will take the time to pin at all of those intersections, and then you can see here, like right here, these 4 blocks are going to meet up. I'll take the time to pin this intersection too. If there's going to be 4 things that come together into a point, then I'm going to pin that. Over here, where this is solid and there's no real intersection of points that have to match up, I don't bother to pin these. I pin these corners that are going to intersect, and I pin these little ones, but I don't bother to pin if there's a solid piece of white here, because there's nothing for it to match up to. It doesn't have to be as perfect. I tend to do row by row, so I've got a set of 3 rows here. I would sew this whole row, I'd sew this next whole row, I'd sew that whole next row, and each time I lay them out, I try to make sure if there's seam allowances coming together, like this one's super easy. All I have to do is flip this over and get it sewn. And again, I put these ones, this is a solid strip, so I put this facing down. Since I'm sewing right along that, there's nothing, no seam allowances to get tucked under by accident. I can see the seams this way, and so I'm just going to sew right over top of that real fast. And I don't have to pin these because they're not intersecting anything. Just line it up and go. I have little lines on my throat plate over here just to make sure that I am sewing up at 1/4 inch. I pay real close attention to that. I don't even look at the needle going up. I just look at the marks on the throat plate to make sure I'm hitting that 1/4 inch mark. Alright, that one's done. And then we're going to add on one more. And this one, I've taken time to line it up the same way. These go up, so these are going up towards 12 o'clock. So these ones here on top are facing down at 6 o'clock. I'm just going to line those up here and stick my pins in. Now this time it's the bottom piece that's going to go underneath first. So it looks like I'm pinning opposite the seam allowance, but I'm hitting the one from underneath. That way, even though I can't see them, I'm going to know that this is pinned into place, and it should go through those feed, or under the, over the feed dogs and under that presser foot without flipping the pieces back in the opposite direction where I don't want them to. The whole goal is so that this quilt lays as flat as possible. Sew that with a 1/4 inch seam again. And again, I pay no attention to that needle. I just watch that 1/4 inch mark all along the way. Ender there. Snip that off and reuse it. It's just a piece of scrap. Pull my pins. Check my intersections. And those are about as perfect as I can get them. That is the trick, is pinning those intersections when you can. All right. It's about as easy as it gets, guys. Just line out your blocks real careful. If you were to make the decision that, these seam allowances are going the opposite direction, there's a couple ways to fix that. In the seam allowance, I had to do this on a few of them behind me. I actually undid just the parts in between the seam allowances. I literally just snipped one end, snipped the other, undid the stitches in between, repressed them the opposite direction, and then restitched them down. Is it a pain? Yes, it can be. Is it worth it? In the end, yes. because my quilt's going to lay flatter, it's going to quilt out better, and I'm not going to be upset when I feel later on some seams go one way and oh, there's a fold in the fabric and it doesn't lay flat there. It's one of those nitpicky little details. Not everyone is that picky, and you don't have to be. It's just my own preference. I hope that you guys have enjoyed this project with me. I've really enjoyed working with all of you and, you know, sharing notes and experiences with everyone. If you have any questions, always feel free to contact me, okay? It's so nice to meet you all. You guys have a wonderful night.